So we hear a lot about this, we see the effects that it has on different members throughout the cast, but rarely do we explore just how vile Zouken's worm Magecraft truly is. I think one of the bigger resounding questions is, why did he pick this Magecraft in particular? Out of all the other things he could have chose, he chose to use worms. And it's not really a common foundation either. From the outside looking in, you would think, oh, this wouldn't be that effective to Zouken, but he found a way to make it work. One of the core reasons for this is him trailing behind and following the Iceburn Witch and wanting to help out with that. Now, the Iceburns are homunculi, so they're gonna be around regardless. But Zouken, if he wants to remain a part of this, that's a whole different case. You know, he came all the way to Japan from Russia, and he realized very early that if he wanted to achieve this goal, he would have to extend the natural expectancy of his body. And there's many different ways to do this, but in his mind, the most practical ended up being the worms. I feel like they were just a lot less of a hassle to deal with in the moment. So going back to Phase Zero, right off the bat, you got Kariya the bozo dragging himself back in after he's left the household. He has no mage experience, and now he wants to participate in the war because he's a good guy. The story lets us know that he's already aware of the devious methods of Zouken's Magecraft as part of the reason why he left. But he also knows that just like Zouken, he needs this to get where he needs to go. Now mind you that when Kariya was asking him to teach him about the worm Magecraft, this was a year before the 4th Grail War kicked off, before the masters got selected. So automatically this lets us know that this style at the very least is extremely efficient in terms of speed, which again would explain why Zouken picked it up. For a person to walk in with zero experience, and then you're telling me that in less than a year this Magecraft can get them up to par, perhaps even better, it's a no-brainer. That speaks volumes. You know, off the top of my head, practicing projection for a year wouldn't help the average person. Practicing gem Magecraft for a year wouldn't help the average person. Necromancy, because things like that are very precise, so it trumps in that category. When he does this, we immediately see him inject Kariya with his Crestworms. These are the worms that he uses that allows his Magecraft to take effect in someone else's body. The worms go in and they expand the magic circuits that are already there. That's their main thing. Kariya already had good potential, so he just needed the worms to make up the difference. Despite the fact that he did leave, he was built for being a mage. That's one of the reasons why Zouken was so frustrated with him. Now when it comes to Zouken's magic crest, which is his Crestworms, they operate differently. I've seen people talk about how, you know, the original magic crest has a very low compatibility rate when it comes to transplanting. Even among somebody that's in your lineage, it's highly likely that that transplant won't work and it just might kill them. I've also seen people argue that the reason why Zouken chose to use these worms is that it would boost the compatibility rate and make this less likely to happen. But one of the first things that Kariya brings up in the novel is that he would be more compatible than Zouken trying to use Sakura, and he knows that because he's from the family. So it's less about being compatible, because as he stated, this could easily go just as wrong as any other transplant. The thing about Zouken's transplant is that it allows him to maintain control. The core function of these Crestworms, all of them, they all go back to Zouken, which is something that's unfamiliar to most people handing off a crest. Sometimes people might hand off a crest in parts, sometimes they might hand off the whole thing, but ideally they are handing it off. But the way that Zouken's crest operates, it allows him to maintain all the power even when he passes his Magecraft off. He knows what you're doing, he knows where you are, and he can invade your system and cause you to suffer even more. And that's a lot of what was happening in the 4th Grail War. It can make you irrational just from being there. Now, this had nothing to do with Kariya's selfish intentions. Those were always there. But I will admit that they certainly didn't help. So looking at this, it's fair to say that Zouken is a very researched man. I mean, why wouldn't he be? How could you get to this level without it? How could you reach limited immortality without it and survive this long? Assumably with no assistance. I've never heard of anybody helping Zouken to get him to where he is, in terms of Magecraft at least. All of this is presented to be his doing. So again, that says a lot. Now that Kariya has come back, Zouken feels obligated to put him through the ringer and make him suffer for leaving the family high and dry. He made him suffer through the worms, he made him suffer through turning Lancelot into a berserker. All of this would go hand in hand. And just to show how crucial the invasion of these worms are, when Kariya first asked Zouken to do this, he said, well, I'll just let your body be a training ground for the worms for about a week. I don't expect you to last longer than that. If you can last longer than a week, I might take you serious. So this isn't something for the faint of heart in any way. You would think for somebody to use this type of magecraft, they'd have to be insane. But it's like, okay, to reach the pinnacle of any magecraft, you gotta be at least a little insane, right? It's just like acquiring wealth. There's a level that's respectable, and that level is likely just above average. But to be phenomenal, most of the time you have to sacrifice a little humanity for that. And I'm thinking about Shiro when I say this, but this really goes for anybody that just goes super hard on one focus. The lords at the clock tower, the cryptors, Darius, you gotta really push that threshold. So as much as I'd like to say that he's crazy, at a certain point, everybody's crazy. Because I can guarantee you that nobody's shooting to be mediocre. It's like, yeah, I can't wait to be the most mediocre mage around. Nobody's saying that. Everybody's shooting to be the best they can. Otherwise, why shoot at all? Zouken is crazy though, don't be fooled. But it's not for that reason, it's how he does it. The story does make mention that once these worms get inside you, you will become Zouken's puppet. If not literally, then figuratively. And we're gonna get into that later with Sakura. It tells us that even if Kariya managed to somehow survive the Fourth Grail War, his flesh would be devoured by the worms by the time that the year was over. At best, he was only expected to live a few years after that. Now this is something that's narrated, by the way. This is not something that was told directly to Kariya, but I'm sure he got the picture regardless. And honestly, by that point, I don't even think surviving was on his mind unless he had some type of silly goal of winning the war, wishing for good health so he can look like the hero and they can all be some type of happy family. Who knows? I don't know what that guy was thinking, man. So we continue to progress throughout the war, and now the worms are starting to take the shape and function like actual magic circuits themselves, which is a good thing because that means that they're working, and that's one of their other functions. They can function like artificial magic circuits. But this also means that the worms are now what's keeping Kariya alive, so he's stuck to them. And this is around the time where he did in fact get selected by the Grail to be a master a year later. There's a specific moment in Stay Night that this reminds me of, and it's where we find that Shiro was using his magic circuits in the wrong way. He was using his actual nerves instead of flipping the switch for his circuits and leaving them on. So Ren was teaching him how to do this effectively. Kariya is kinda in the same position. The very nature of him activating these worms to do anything means that the worms are going to get riled up. And when they get riled up, they're gonna rip at his organs. They're gonna do anything they can to get the energy that they need, which really puts you in a catch-22 because you're sitting here trying to go all out, but if he does too much, then the worms are just gonna eat him alive from the inside. He had to walk the balance, which is another reason why Sakura was tense a lot, because she always had to walk that balance as to not aggravate the worms. And she honestly had way more going on. So yeah, every time he tried to do something, every time Lancelot tried to do something, it was tearing him apart. He also spit some of these out. And what this shows is that these worms are growing, they're breeding inside of him because they aren't the same ones that you normally see. There's also a point where Kariya said, well, if I'm going against my nemesis, you can devour my entire body. I don't care. I just want enough power to beat him. And of course, he's talking about Tokiomi. So Tokiomi is your nemesis now, even though a bunch of people have this headcanon that it wasn't that dramatic. Yeah, okay. So around the part where Tokiomi starts to enter the picture, the worms have gotten mature enough to be sent out as his familiars. You have these maggot-like worms that are described to be the size of mice start to transform into beetle variants. And we've run into this quite a bit. We've seen them in FGO, in the Fate Excel event. It's stated that though they may look small, these worms are carnivorous and they will eat an entire bull and crush his bones in literal seconds. They're practically like insect piranhas. And despite all that, Tokiomi just tore straight through him with his flames, didn't even break a sweat. But I will say that Tokiomi did get lucky because he was a lot more equipped for that fight than the average person. He had flames. We all know that insects are weak to flames by default. It's likely that this would not have been as easy if Tokiomi didn't have these different elements to toss around. But fortunate for him, he had this at his disposal. Then we see a new development when Tokiomi burns him alive and he ends up making it back to the underground cage with the worms, thanks to Kariya healing him. Zouken points out that the worms were starting to heal his burned body. So these worms can even provide healing capabilities at the cost of the internal strife that's going on inside. Everything just goes back to that. And they were healing him extremely fast too. This could be because Kariya was their nest, so they're treating him especially with proper care because as long as he goes on, they do too. This is also a point where Zouken decides, well, you're already down and out. I might as well be the one to give you a boost. So he punches Kariya in the throat with his cane, forces him to open up his mouth, and inside goes one of his huge lustworms. And it says that the worm buried off into his stomach and started to revitalize him with energy. That's not even the worst part about this worm. The worst part is that this was the same worm that took Sakura's innocence. And like I said before, things like this is what makes Zouken sick. Kariya was benefiting not only off of the worm that took her, but also took her soul away. Again, these lustworms, they operate differently. They feed off blood, semen, and bone marrow, and nerves. Man, I mean, it's disgusting. If you've been through it, the original format, the appearance of these worms, they look like penises. They're literally drawn to look like penises, which further pushes the point of what they're for. So it's rather ironic that the same energy that's giving him a boost was the same thing that brought Sakura down, which is a shot not just at his physical, but at his mental as well. Later on, the story starts to tell us that Kariya's body is actually disabled, and the only reason that he's able to move is because of the worms at this point. By the end of the war, most of the worms had died off because of Lancelot abusing the energy over and over again. They couldn't take it, and Zouken is just sitting back monitoring all of this because again, Zouken is the worms himself, so he can do that. And then of course you have the scene right before his death with Kariya and Sakura, and this showcasing if you disobey Zouken, this is what's going to happen to you. This is the future that lies ahead for her if she ever tried to go against his word, which is fine. It makes sense that she wouldn't go against him. One thing that I gotta get back into is something concerning Sakura. I didn't want to jumble up the storylines and go back and forth. So the moment that Sakura got to the Zouken household, when they made the trade, she got sent straight down to the worm pit, and she was down there getting abused by those lustworms. Zouken mentioned that she was crying for the first 3 days, and by the 4th day, complete silence. And that's where you see this soulless appearance come from. The thing about this is that it was merely a test. He didn't believe that she would survive half a day. But to him, the fact that she was able to make it that far, he's like, well, at least she's not defective. What? Yo, this dude is abominable. Like actually. But we knew that though. So yeah, Sakura would lay in the pit with these worms covered from head to toe, and then she would go back to regular scheduled programming, and then you got people telling her that what she was going through wasn't that big of a deal. I guess. Couldn't do anything about it. All is a part of her being Zouken's catalyst. That's the craziest thing. Zouken was just using her to be a vessel. He didn't even end up using her to become a fighter. This is a pain far worse than Kariya's because at least with Kariya, it came to an end. With Sakura, this is something that she had to endure her entire life and then some. Kariya went through what he went through for a year, the few weeks that the war took place, and then it was over over with. Sakura went through this for 11 years straight. So now we can bring this over to Stay Night, and this gets deeper off into the Lustworms. It lets us know that these Lustworms will invade the skin with their mucus and destroy the person's nerves via pleasure once they get stimulated. So it's a continuous thing, and this is why she was always trying to get down with Shiro. It wasn't just for the sake of doing it. She needed this because if they didn't get the magical energy that they needed, they would start tearing at her insides too, the same way that they were doing with Kariya. So she had to deal with that on top of being violated by the worms. This doesn't even include, Shinji going behind the scenes and doing what he did. Several times throughout Stay Night, you go back to this worm pit and we get a better look at it. It's an entire pit that's full of stone. It's got stone walls with holes in them, and this is their natural breeding ground. This is where he keeps all of his worms. It's said to look almost infinite. The average human being, if they came down here, they wouldn't even last a minute. And it shows us that when Zouken takes form, he basically assimilates the worms and becomes whole. They start to eat at the bottom of his body, and this is what gives his body form. And keep in mind that this body is just his avatar. Zouken is truly made up of worms, and he's mentioned this constantly, that he's always in need of more. He tells us that the ones that he has in his basement will last him for at least the next 100 years. Zouken's worm pit is really what solidifies the route turning into Heaven's Field. In the other two routes, it didn't really have any involvement except for the few scenes with Shinji and Gil. And even from the movie, when you look through the visions of Sakura, you can see these huge arachnoid variants or these huge reptile-like worm variants that we haven't even seen yet. And these Lustworms, they also have different functions between men and women. The main thing for the men is that they get their bones crushed and they get their brains sucked. And then for the women, they like to attack the woman's nerves. And they have this natural disposition towards the woman's womb because that's their general makeup. Who writes this? And then they proceed to give the woman orgasms that fries her brain, and then they go throughout her body, go to the womb, find the placenta, and they consume that as well. But yeah, when it comes to the basement, this is his magical workshop. And if you look at these holes, they're more like chambers, and that's because these chambers are where he stores his victims and leaves their bodies to be decomposed by the worms. One thing that it really gets into is that even if Zouken were to remove the worms by the point of Stay Night, Sakura would still go down because of the Grail fragments. So they have to be there because they're fused with the worms, and the worms are operating as her artificial circuits now. But he claims that he hasn't been doing anything to her up until this point in time, that she's mostly breaking down from being the second Grail vessel. Cav. Another part that we have is one of the ones involving Kirei, where he explains that insects are actually the lowest ranked familiars that you can have, and the only thing that they can really do is tell the master if the host is still alive or not. So normally the worms are at bay until they get activated, then they start to terrorize the person's body. Back when Shinji put the aphrodisiac on Sakura, this caused the worms to go out of control and they started to be riled up again. They're more like security to keep Sakura from breaking conditions, and now that they've been awakened, from that point on in the story, they're gonna continue to torture her and she's gonna continue to lose her mind. So now that these Grail pieces have been inserted inside of her, because Zouken did do this, he infused the Grail pieces with the worms and placed it inside of Sakura. You have the worms fighting for this Grail energy, and then you also have Medusa fighting for that same energy. This hurts her even more. So Kirei goes through a process where he tries to save her, he purifies her, he heals her of the poison, he extracted some of the Crestworms, and he compared it to revitalizing somebody's heart. That's how serious it was. Kirei mentioned that he was able to remove most of the Crestworms from her, but a good portion of them were buried too deep for him to do anything about it. All he did was decrease her pain and cut off part of Zouken's influence. And he said this alone saved her life. If he didn't get involved, she would have been taken out at that point. One thing that needs to be pointed out again is that Zouken has 3 different bodies. He's got his avatar that's made completely of worms, which on a physical level technically makes him invulnerable because he has no actual form. And we've seen this a lot too. Every time you try to go for a hit on Zouken, he just turns into a pile of worms. So he can't be harmed by normal means. You have his main body and then you have his backup body. His main body was actually inside of Sakura. And this is what needs to be taken out before you even begin to think that you're going to get rid of him. Because the way that Zouken operates now is less about the body and him continuing to feed his soul. He goes around feasting upon people in order to survive. And we've seen this with the scene, including the woman. You know, he found her, completely devoured her body. And when they got done feasting, the worms started to turn into him. So he has to keep digesting human flesh in order to keep his body going, or more specifically, keep his soul going. And Crestworm is just in the background watching, and he explains to him that he's gonna continue to rot no matter what. He can't help it now. And that's why he has to keep doing this. Even though he can keep reforming his body, it doesn't stop his soul from deteriorating. But he chose the path of becoming an insect, so he just has to deal with it because he wanted to survive as long as he possibly could. And Crestworm asked him why even take the form of an old man, and Zouken told him this is the only thing I can take form of. It's gotten just that bad. You know, it's a stark difference between how he used to look, what we seen in the flashbacks in FGO London, as opposed to the rotting corpse that we see now, due to that constant decrease in his soul's value. He even mentioned that he used to be able to survive for 50 years without going on this consuming rampage, but as of Stay Night, this has dropped down to a couple of months. So it's getting to a point where Zouken wouldn't be able to continue anyway. And I think that's why he went ahead and decided to push forward with the Grail Vessel idea when he did, because honestly, he was running out of time. In greater details, he's devoured thousands and thousands of people just to maintain his existence. And he actually hates himself for it. Because again, this isn't who Zouken wanted to be. He hates the fact that he turned himself into the worms and that he's rotting away at his core. And the same thing went with his personality. It's driven him insane. And naturally, that extends to everybody else that's around him. And you know, I've mentioned that they are carnivorous, but Shiro managed to get away from them. So you do have a little window as long as you don't stay near them for a long time. But this doesn't have to be the case. There is a dead end where he experienced a variant of Zouken's worms that he's never seen before. And they were able to get up on his feet and straight up devour him at the ankles. And then they started to enter his body from the hole in his legs, eat his bones, and then eat the rest of his flesh on top of that. So it just goes to show, given the opportunity, they will do it. Even when Kariya got rid of his avatar, when he exercised it in Heaven's Field, because he didn't get rid of the main body, Zouken was still able to survive. As I mentioned before, his worms have incredible observation. You see them at times all throughout the city when Shiro is doing his patrols or when they're heading off into the cavern. They're everywhere. We've seen these worms completely take over Medea's corpse and use them for his own version of puppet manipulation. Now that's something that's extremely powerful. How do you take over somebody else's body and start to use their moves with just the worms? For something to be the lowest scale, that's actually extremely good. But how many times have we heard that saying anyway? Oh, well, normally this Magecraft wouldn't be effective, and then the person turns out to make it more effective than ever. This is just one example. I personally feel like there is tons of things that we haven't seen from Zouken. He's been around for so long, nearly won the Third War. Even when Prelati was trying to observe the Fifth Grail War in Strange Fate, and I've mentioned that in her video. Zouken was boxing her out from every angle with just his worms. He had the whole thing secured. Every time she tried to get in, he would just have the worms devour her body. And this is Prelati we're talking about. She's more than equipped to deal with something like this. And here you have Zouken in the last stretches of his life still can't get in on them. And it just goes to show how difficult it is to get around them. And then you have his backup body. This dude really thinks things out. This man had a backup plan for the backup plan. So on top of the main body that's inside of Sakura, when Sakura smashed his core, the one that controlled everything, he was able to stuff his soul into a backup body that allowed him to survive even that. And of course, you know that eventually he still perished along with the rest of the cave, but it's just the thought of his survival. Even going back to Shinji's flashback, when he was in the worm pit, when he was speaking upon what happened with his mother was only recognized to be a carrier. She wasn't even a real mother, a surrogate to Zouken. And when she didn't produce the results that he wanted, he just threw her into the basement and let the worms have their way. Shinji said that he probably could find her body I mean, but he had no desire to look. Not because it's his mom, it's like, I don't want to see my mother like that. It's because he cursed his mother for giving him failure genetics. So he doesn't want to see her at all out of spite. There's also the scene with Ilya, who mentioned that Zouken had intentions on taking over Sakura's body altogether. Once her personality withered away, Zouken would have took her over too. It just never ends with this man.